Elkwood, a small rural town nestled in the hills of West Virginia, hadn't made headlines since 1978, when a logging truck overturned and shut down the county road for 3 days. Life moved quietly here. People knew each other's birthdays, recipes were passed down by memory, and stories were shared on porches, not online. But in the fall of 2016, something happened that no one in Elkwood would ever forget. And it started with a dog named Buster. Buster was a mixed-breed mutt, brown and wiry, about knee-height, with eyes that always seemed to be scanning the horizon. He wasn't particularly beautiful or trained, but he belonged to Walter Jenkins, and to anyone who knew Walter, Buster was more than just a pet. Walter was a retired coal miner who had lived alone on Barlow Creek Road for nearly 2 decades. His wife, Lorraine, had passed in 2001. No children, just Buster, who showed up as a stray pup on Walter's porch one January morning and never left. For 15 years, the two were inseparable. Walter's rusted Ford always had a blanket for Buster. At the diner on Main, a waitress named June always brought an extra biscuit. Buster waited patiently during Walter's checkups, sat under his chair at town meetings, and lay beside his feet during Sunday service. When Walter passed away in his sleep on October 14, 2016, at the age of 78, everyone in town came to the small church for his funeral. Everyone and Buster. No one expected what happened next. The morning of the service was overcast, wind dragging dead leaves across the cemetery hill. Dozens gathered inside the small white church, its steeple casting a long shadow on the grass. The open casket stood at the front, simple, unadorned pine, just how Walter wanted it. As the congregation filed in, Buster trotted through the front door. No leash, no fuss. He walked straight to the casket and sat down. At first, people thought someone would remove him, but no one did. Then Buster did something that made the entire room still. He lay down beside the casket, placed his head against it, and didn't move. Not during the eulogies, not during the hymns, not during the slow procession of visitors paying their respects. He stayed. When the service ended and the pallbearers lifted the casket, Buster followed, step for step, out to the cemetery, where the grave waited under a crooked oak. As Walter was lowered into the earth, Buster sat just feet away, tail still, head bowed. And after the last clump of soil was placed and people began to drift off, Buster stayed. That night, the temperature dropped to the low 40s. A local farmer, driving by the cemetery, saw the dog curled up on the fresh grave. By morning, Buster was still there. By the second morning, word had spread across Elkwood. At first, it was whispers at the diner, then posts on the community bulletin board. Finally, someone snapped a photo with their phone, a grainy shot of Buster lying motionless atop Walter Jenkins' grave, covered in morning dew. It wasn't just sentimentality. It was something else, something people couldn't quite explain. Buster wasn't eating, wasn't barking, just staying. June, the waitress who used to sneak him biscuits, brought a bowl of water and a slice of sausage. She set it near him. He didn't move. "Come on, boy," she said softly. "You need something in your belly." Nothing. The local veterinarian, Dr. Hank Rowley, came by to check on him. No fever, no injury, just mourning. "I've never seen anything like it," Hank told the local paper. "This isn't instinct. This is devotion." By day 3, people began bringing blankets, food, even a small wooden shelter to protect him from the wind. He wouldn't sleep in it, but they kept it nearby, just in case. One child left a note taped to the side of the grave. "You're a good boy, Buster. Walter is proud of you." Another left a worn tennis ball. And still, Buster stayed. On the 6th day, Reverend Wallace, who had buried Walter, walked to the grave with his Bible in hand. He sat on a nearby bench and opened to Ecclesiastes. "To everything there is a season." Buster lifted his head slightly, then rested it again on the mound of dirt. By the end of the 2nd week, it was clear this wasn't a passing moment. This was grief, and Elkwood began to change around it. People who hadn't spoken in years met at the cemetery gate. Strangers shared thermoses of coffee. Teens who once mocked church folks stood silent in respect. "I don't know why," said Sheriff Glenn Watkins, "but that dog brought something out of this town I ain't seen since the flood cleanup back in '97. Made us all remember each other." A woman who hadn't been to her mother's grave in 15 years came one morning after hearing about Buster. She sat 3 rows away and wept. A local reporter picked up the story, then regional news, then national. By the 3rd week, news vans arrived from Charleston and Columbus. They filmed respectfully. Then, inevitably, the world saw, and the world reacted. Donations arrived for Walter's Memorial Fund. Letters came in from Oregon, Maine, even Germany. One read, "In a world that often feels cold, this dog reminded us what loyalty looks like." Another, "Please give Buster a warm place to sleep. He's earned it." But Buster refused every offer. He stayed. Rain came. Frost, too. Still, he stayed. By day 23, Elkwood had stopped treating Buster like just a dog. He had become something else, a presence, a kind of living monument. The cemetery caretaker, Elijah Moore, once skeptical of the attention, now made his morning rounds with a thermos of hot broth just for Buster. He'd sit on the bench and talk to him like an old friend. "Still here, huh? Can't say I blame you. He was a good man." Buster didn't answer, of course, but his ears sometimes twitched when Elijah spoke. At night, volunteers took shifts keeping an eye on the cemetery, not to protect Buster, but almost to guard the sacredness of what was happening. Teenagers gave up parties to bring blankets. Older residents brought lawn chairs, sitting in silence just to be near. One Sunday, Reverend Wallace led a special service, not inside the church, but right there, under the crooked oak tree. People came with candles. They sang hymns softly, while Buster rested at the foot of the grave. No one told them to come. They just did. And then, one morning, something changed. Buster was gone. The grave was undisturbed. The bowl still full. The blankets untouched. People searched the hills, called his name, alerted shelters and the vet's office. But there was no trace. It was day 29. For some, his disappearance felt like the final chapter. For others, it felt like something more. "Maybe he was done," said June at the diner. Maybe he said his goodbye. Elijah just nodded. Maybe Walter called him home. The town grieved him, not as a lost pet, but as a neighbor, a healer, a mirror to their better selves. A month later, Elijah found something behind the cemetery tool shed. Half buried beneath brush, dry and curled up like he had simply gone to sleep. Buster. He looked peaceful. There were no signs of injury, no struggle, just rest. Elijah wrapped him in a quilt someone had left weeks earlier and placed him beside Walter's grave. Not on it, beside it, like always. The town buried him with a small wooden marker, hand-carved, "Buster, loyal to the end, 2001 to 2016. They planted wildflowers around the grave. The Reverend read a verse, and then the town stood in silence. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already been lived. In the weeks that followed Buster's burial, something lingered in Elkwood. It wasn't sadness exactly, not the kind that stifles or isolates. It was reverence, like the town had touched something eternal and was trying to hold on. People began stopping by the grave without needing a reason. A young father brought his son and whispered, "This is the dog that stayed." A retired teacher brought her sketchpad and drew the crooked oak above them both. Local carpenter Roy Lancaster offered to build a bench nearby. He shaped it by hand and carved a line into the backrest. Stay, love, remember. It became known simply as Buster's Bench. But Elkwood didn't stop there. Inspired by Buster's story, the community raised funds to renovate the old animal shelter, which had been in disrepair for years. They named the project the Buster Trust. Volunteers stepped forward, teenagers, veterans, even the mayor's wife. Within months, they had built insulated kennels, repaired the drainage system, started a local foster program for senior dogs. Dr. Rowley, the town vet, began offering free checkups for rescues over the age of 8. One spring morning, Elijah was approached by a soft-spoken woman from Ohio named Margaret Ellis. She had driven 4 hours after reading Buster's story online. "My husband passed last year," she said, standing by the grave. "I've felt so lost. But this gave me something I didn't know I needed." She left a collar at the base of the marker. It belonged to her husband's old dog, now gone too. Over the summer, letters continued to arrive from across the country. One came from a widow in Kansas. "I haven't spoken to my sister in 12 years. I don't even remember why, but I called her yesterday because I read about your dog. I figured, if he could stay, maybe I could reach out." Another from a boy in Montana. "My dad left, but our dog didn't. I told him about Buster. He said he wished he had stayed too." What began as mourning had turned into movement. What began as one dog's quiet vigil had become a kind of rebirth. And Elkwood, once a forgotten dot on a backroad map, was now known for something else: love that doesn't leave. As Elkwood's story spread, attention naturally turned to the man at the center of it all, Walter Jenkins. Until now, Walter had been mostly remembered as that quiet old miner with the dog. But now, people wanted to know more. Who was he really? Reverend Wallace invited townspeople to share their memories in a community journal he kept at the church vestibule. The pages filled quickly. One woman wrote, "Walter once fixed my back porch without being asked. I was 6 months pregnant and alone at the time. He left before I could even say thank you." A former student recalled, "I got caught stealing candy when I was 15. Walter didn't scold me. He sat with me, asked why I did it, then gave me a job painting his fence. Paid me better than I deserved." Another entry simply read, "He listened. That was his gift." June, the diner waitress, contributed a photo. It showed Walter and Buster on the front porch of the diner. Buster's tongue out, Walter mid-laugh, a coffee mug in one hand and a slice of peach pie in the other. That image became a kind of unofficial emblem for the town's rebirth. Postcards, mugs, even a mural, painted by local high schoolers on the side of the Elkwood Feed and Supply. It wasn't about fame. It was about memory, legacy, gratitude. Later that year, on October 14, 2017, exactly 1 year after Walter's passing, Elkwood held its first annual Day of Staying. It was part memorial, part celebration. People brought their dogs to Buster's grave. Others came with stories, photographs, baked goods. The children read poems under the oak. The mayor gave a short speech. A quartet played Amazing Grace on fiddles and harmonicas. As the sun dipped low over the hills, the Reverend said, "Buster didn't know he was making history. He was just doing what his heart told him to do. And maybe that's the most powerful thing any of us can do." That night, Elijah sat alone on Buster's bench, long after the crowd had gone. He looked up at the stars and said softly, "You stayed, old boy, long enough to remind us who we are." By the second year of the Day of Staying, people from out of state began attending. They didn't just come to witness, they came to heal. There was Marcia, a nurse from Pittsburgh, who sat quietly under the crooked oak with her therapy dog and read aloud a letter to her late husband. There was Enrique, a veteran from Kentucky, who said he'd spent years not feeling anything until he saw a photo of Buster online and cried for the first time in a decade. There was even a group of schoolchildren from Charleston who raised money to build a second bench near Buster's grave. On it, they engraved their own words, "Loyalty lives here." In the third year, something else happened. The Elkwood Animal Shelter, rebuilt with donations and local hands, was operating at full capacity, but in the best way. Every dog had a foster option. Senior dogs were given priority. A sign was placed at the entrance, "The Buster Home, for dogs who stay." And it wasn't just animals who were transformed. Teen volunteers, who once saw shelter duty as boring, now showed up early, walking dogs, washing bowls, reading out loud to anxious pups. "I think he changed me," said Nia, 17, stroking a shy greyhound's back. "I want to be the kind of person a dog like Buster would wait for." Meanwhile, Buster's grave remained untouched. No gates, no ropes. Just fresh wildflowers, handwritten notes, and the occasional tennis ball. People often left quietly, wiping their eyes, not because it was sad, but because it was true. One snowy morning, Dr. Hank Rowley, now semi-retired, visited the grave and left a folded piece of paper. It read, "I've treated animals for 42 years, but that old mutt, he taught me more than all the textbooks ever did. Goodbye, Buster. You were the best of us." By now, tourists asked the same question when they visited. Was the story real? Locals always gave the same answer. "Come sit on the bench and tell me what you feel." By the fifth year, Buster's story had been written about in books, featured in a documentary, and even mentioned in a speech at a veterinary conference in Chicago. But Elkwood never let it become a spectacle. There were no ticket booths, no souvenirs, no Buster the movie, just the grave, the bench, and a town that remembered. At the school, students now read a short story called "The Dog Who Stayed" in 4th grade English. The final assignment asked, "What would you stay for?" The answers were simple, sometimes scribbled in crayon. "My mom when she's sad. My dog when he's scared. My friend when he feels alone." One teacher cried while grading the papers. And yet, the true legacy wasn't in books or plaques. It was in what people started doing, quietly, without fanfare. Neighbors checked in on each other more often. People stayed 5 extra minutes after church just to sit in silence. A local man named Greg Tomlin, who'd once struggled with depression, adopted a senior beagle named Rosie. He told the shelter staff, "If that old dog could wait a month in the cold, I can find the strength to hold on too." Even the town council, once split on nearly every vote, came together unanimously on one proposal, renaming the park trail behind the cemetery to Buster's Path. A sign at the entrance reads, "Not all who wait are lost. Some are just reminding us what love looks like." In late autumn of the 6th year, Reverend Wallace passed away in his sleep, much like Walter had. At his funeral, held under the same crooked oak, someone placed a photograph beside the casket. Buster, resting beside Walter's grave under falling leaves. The town didn't plan it. It just happened. It felt right. When the new pastor arrived, she asked the congregation, "Why do so many people come to this little town?" June, the diner waitress, replied, "Because somewhere along the way, Elkwood stopped being just a place on a map. It became a place where love stays." By the 10th anniversary of Buster's vigil, Elkwood had changed, not in size, not in wealth, but in heart. The cemetery remained quiet, just as Walter would have liked. The crooked oak stood firm, the bench smoothed by time and weather. The grass was always neatly trimmed, and someone, no one knew exactly who, replaced the flowers at Buster's grave every Sunday morning before dawn. On the 10th day of staying, the town gathered again, more than ever before. Children sang, locals spoke, and the Reverend, young but wise beyond her years, shared something new. A letter. It had arrived anonymously a week earlier, typed on plain paper, no return address. "I came through Elkwood 5 years ago by accident. My life was falling apart. Divorce, bankruptcy. I was driving without knowing where I was going. I stopped for gas. Someone at the pump told me about a dog that stayed. I walked to the cemetery, sat on the bench, read the words. That night, I called my son. We talked for the first time in 2 years. I've been sober ever since. Thank you, Elkwood. Thank you, Buster." Silence followed the reading, not because no one was moved, but because they were. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the town lit candles along Buster's path. The glow curved gently toward the cemetery, where families walked in quiet procession. Old friends embraced. Children asked questions. Dogs wagged their tails. It wasn't about a spectacle. It was about remembrance, about the kind of love that doesn't demand attention, but offers presence, a staying kind of love. As the last candle flickered, June, now retired, sat on Buster's bench, blanket on her lap, and whispered, "You were just a dog, but you made us better people." And for a long moment, it felt as if the whole town breathed in unison. Epilogue. There's no statue in Elkwood, no marble monument, just a marker, a bench, a path, and a story passed from voice to voice, porch to porch. A story about a dog who stayed by a grave for 29 days, and in doing so, helped a whole town remember how to stay for one another. If this story touched you, let it live on. Share it. Leave a comment. Let someone know they're not alone. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us what really matters. And as always, thank you for listening.